So I'm going to kick off fairly punctually because I think we've got an awful lot to get through. So I am overjoyed by our guests today. The first guest we have, and seriously, with these two guests, we could probably have a 5-hour conversation and not get bored. The first guest we have is Despina Katsikakis. Oh, I've got to say that correctly. Katsikakis, I think. Katsikakis, who has the most incredible job title I've ever read. She is the executive partner, global head of Total Workplace at Cushman & Wakeman. She is also the president of the British Council for Offices. So we also have with us today Steve Chamberlain. Many of you will know Steve. He is one of the lead coaches and facilitators at Ivy House. He has worked with thousands of leaders across pretty much every sector. He's also the former director of the London Business Forum, and he is the author of the brilliant book On Purpose. I'm Elke Edwards. I'm the founder of Ivy House. It's really lovely to see some of very recognizable faces here today. I'm going to ask you all, if you can, to keep your cameras on. From our perspective, it makes a massive difference to talk to human beings rather than just blank spaces. We understand if you can't do that, but it'd be lovely to see you. Ivy House, as I guess many of you will already know, but there are some new faces here today. Ivy House are experts in leadership and talent development. And I think even more importantly than that, we are experts in behavioral change. If you want to create change in your organization, there is no other way to do it. So if you're sitting there in your organization with a project that may be of interest to Ivy House, please get in touch with us. So we have a tight 45 minutes today, and we're going to begin to tackle, I think, I was actually sitting here figuring this out. I think it's probably the most important topic that we address in our work. So I'm going to be hosting a conversation between the three of us. Because we're tight on time, I'm going to ask you to put questions in the chat. We may not get time to come to those questions. If we don't, we will come back to you separately, but I'm going to do my best to give us some space at the end for questions. I think that's all I have to tell you in terms of administratively. And as always, we would love your feedback. We build these events based on your feedback. So Bryony will be asking you to contribute to feedback. It's only a very quick couple of questions. So before we start to talk to what is level 2 wellbeing, I think we need to just address for one moment what actually well-being, why it's such a key topic. And I know I'm going to be preaching to the choir slightly, but I have some interesting stats I think you're going to be interested in. So the health of our workforce is rapidly deteriorating. You may well be experiencing that in your own businesses. And that's happening at a time when businesses are struggling to attract and retain talent. We're in the tightest job market we've seen in decades. Now, this stat blew my mind. I got to get this stat right. So the cost to poor health is up 150 billion per annum. That's an additional 5K per employee. Also, if you combine into that the loss of positive returns from having improved productivity, healthy people, attracting and retaining the right people. So if we combine those two things, lost productivity with the cost savings from lower attrition, apparently, we just read this correctly, we would unlock between 130 to 370 billion across the UK. So that is an average of between 4 to 12K per employee. I don't know how good you guys are at maths, but even in a small business like ours, that makes quite a big difference. So the other thing we saw from our own research is that only 25% of organizations have seen an increased focus on well-being in their organization. That blew my mind, if I'm honest. That really blew my mind. And only 4% say that they regularly measure the health of their the health and well-being of their employees. So I don't know about you, but all of that adds up to me as a sort of a wake-up call to this well-being crisis. And many people writing or researchers are talking about the well-being crisis as being the next major sort of pandemic that is going to hit us. And from our perspective, that's going to hit our leaders. So it matters, and it really matters. And we know that both morally and individually and commercially. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. We're clearly not going to solve that problem in the next 45 minutes. We are good at Ivy House, but I don't think we're quite that good. But what I wanted to do is to use this time to point to two of the most game-changing elements, I think, that are going to be part of any successful plan that you're going to put together to combat this crisis. So before we go to those two elements, and that's Despina and Stephen are going to do that. Before we go to that, what do I mean, or what do we at Ivy House mean when we talk about level 2 wellbeing? So most organizations today have got to level 1. You know, they may be offering discounted gym memberships or flexible working, or, you know, access to a mindfulness app. They're a bit more mindful about well-being. And that, of course, is great. I mean, you know, of course, that is valuable. But the reality is it's not going to solve the problem. And I think level 2 well-being is challenging us to notice that. That's not, it's like putting a plaster, I think, over a dirty wound. So level 2 well-being goes far deeper. I think what it really means is switching our focus to thinking about how we can create productive businesses, to switching our focus to understanding how we create businesses in which people thrive. Recognizing that when they thrive, we're going to have really healthy businesses. So that's a mindset shift for leaders, really. That's a mindset shift from it's all about production, getting the results, to looking at what is going to fuel those results. And I think there are some key things that need to shift to get us to that place. Now, I just want you, this is going to sound like pie in the sky, but I just want you to imagine for a moment working in an organization where people did work that they loved, that they were really thriving in, work that they were talented in, work that they were naturally interested in growing in. What difference would it make to your organization? Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist, does it, to recognize that it's going to mean we will produce better results. So again, I'm going to say, to me, it makes sense morally and commercially. So how do we do it? Well, I obviously thought about this before we showed up today. How do we do it? We need to think differently about how we use our physical space and therefore how we work. And I think we also need to teach people to understand the true nature of well-being. The fact that it is not dependent on a whole load of stuff outside of us. You know, I've got to be with the right man or the right woman. I've got to do the right work. I've got to have this amount of sleep and all of that stuff. It's not reliant on our happy list, but it is instead something that already exists within us. And our job is to move towards it every day, as opposed to away from every day. And then the final piece, I think, is really about looking at how we equip our leaders with the skills to create the environment where people thrive. So, Despina, I am going to come to you first. And I've got 2 questions for you. It's probably really bad hosting etiquette, but my first 2 questions for you is what is your research, your most recent research telling us? And out of that, what most needs to change? Because, you know, a theory I'm running is that we weren't getting this right before the pandemic. It would be really easy to say, well, it's all changed now because people are demanding flexibility and hybrid working and all the rest of it. But I was here before the pandemic and things were pretty stressy before then. So yeah, that's my 2 questions. What's your most recent research telling us and what needs to change?
Well, great to be here, Elke, and to engage with all of you today. So just before I share our own research, interesting to put in context that you mentioned the physical environment. So we spend 90% of our time indoors. And it's interesting that the CDC says that our physical environment and social connections impact at least 50% of our well-being. So it's not just our DNA, right? So this is a really critical issue. So of course, a lot of what we do is we measure the experience people have in workplaces and how that's been changing, particularly over the last few years. So I'm going to share my screen just to be able to kind of show you some specific aspects of the research. Please tell me when you can see my screen. Great. Okay, so what's really interesting is that I think probably the most important piece of data that we heard during the pandemic was that at the end of 2020, 90% of employees felt trusted by their managers to work remotely. Now that number was 35% in 2019. And that number has been really significant in changing employee expectation. So across our data set of our experience per square foot survey, which has over 12 million data points across 185,000 people worldwide, we run this every 3 months. So we're seeing and tracking how these are adapting and changing. 79% of employees want location flexibility. That's flexibility to choose where they work. 94% want flexibility of when they work. So what time of the day should they be doing their job? And what we're seeing is that people that don't have flexibility are over 2.5 times more likely to look for another job. Now, of course, flexibility and demand has been driving a lot of this hybrid work. But in the last year, we've seen mandates begin to be put in place without really considering what implications it has on people. So we've seen trust begin to be negatively impacted. And while those mandates are increasing office attendance by about 14%, they're negatively impacting employee engagement by about 26%. So let's just look across the board. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we look at these are a couple of the data points that we're tracking. But when we look at productivity from our lens, we're looking at two different dimensions. Your ability to effectively do individual focused work and your ability to do effective collaboration. And that remained very stable. This is 2019, the dark blue on the left, 2020, 21, 22. However, it dropped for the first time in 2023. Now on the right, you're seeing people's sense of well-being, which has been dropping steadily year on year and remains very, very low at 39% of people now feeling they have a sense of well-being. So is lower well-being starting to hurt productivity? I would argue, yes, it is. And we will be suffering, as Elke said, very significant setbacks to businesses if this remains unchecked. So what is it that we can do differently? So what's interesting in our data is we sort of begin to look at what is the changing purpose of the office with this shift in priorities and greater expectation of flexibility. And it's quite interesting because we hear a lot from leaders that say people don't want to come to the office. Well, actually, people do want to come to the office, but they want to come to the office for a different reason. They want to come to the office to connect with people. They want to come for community, for social connections, for effective collaboration. Interestingly, the third most important reason is to create boundaries, to separate work and life. And these new types of reasons means we need very different environments for the office. So traditionally, 70% of the office was allocated to individual desks and 30% to meeting rooms. Well, now we need to shift that balance and create places that engender ad hoc serendipitous encounters and allow people to connect with others. We need to have events and curated activities. And most significantly, the workplace experience needs to be enticing enough for people want to make the investment of time and money to visit the office, to come into the office, and compelling enough for people want to repeat and return to the office. So that's a big, big challenge in terms of physical space, but it's also a huge challenge in terms of change management. So the number one impediment to experience is not just the physical office, but it is upskilling leadership. It's changing leadership belief and ensuring that leaders are equipped to manage hybrid teams, to reinvest that trust, and to recognize that people have very diverse needs. Now, that requires really unlearning ingrained behaviors. And what we're really finding is that most leaders tend to use new technology tools in old ways. So we need to purposefully define how we use physical place and technology to help people be more productive. We need to focus on the things that matter, that social connection, community, sense of belonging, both intentionally virtually and in person, and agree collective accountabilities with our teams, respect people and give them that trust to build those new relationships and new outcomes. And of course, finally, the final piece of the puzzle for me is that, I've spent over 40 years working in workplace transformation, and clients always want the answer. What's the perfect office? What's the mix of space? And there is not a single answer. You need to actually maintain an agile and iterative approach and give people a say, actively engage them, and really develop and define what's in it for them that will make an impact. And just kind of, I'm going to stop sharing and come full circle to where Elke started. I think one of the things I've been talking about for years is how do we create environments where people leave the office feeling better than when they arrive? What impact would that have to them as individuals, to corporations in terms of productivity, to society and families? So I think that's the real challenge. It's kind of how do we create those elements together to really help overcome some of the challenges we're seeing in well-being. I'll pause there, Elke. I think you're on mute.
Not good, sorry. I feel quite emotional listening to that, actually. And a couple of things ran through my mind, Despina. The first is that I think whilst changing the way we have our space laid out and all the rest of it is clearly crucial, we also have to deal with the psychological guilt that people will have that they are not ticking tasks off their list. Mm-hmm. Because if they feel they're coming into the office and they're having a coffee with so-and-so and a sandwich with so-and-so, then they're having a chat. Like, we are so productivity focused. And by productivity, we're forgetting all of those creative ideas that come out of conversations. And we're like, task, tick it off our list, tick it off our list. And we're so out of balance in that way. We have to deal with the psychological challenge as well as the space challenge at the same time, don't we?
Well, you're touching on something really interesting. So one of the things I say to clients all the time is that during the pandemic, I believe we broke work process, right? We sort of went into default, into Zoom mode, right? So it is now a free invitation for any gap in my diary for someone to slot in a virtual call.
Yeah.
Now, that means it gives me no time to think, no time to recharge, no time to renew throughout the day. And it builds this guilt and complex set of emotions about, oh my God, if there's a gap, I'm being unproductive because surely I can fit in 3 more virtual meetings in that time. So it means people are working longer hours because they're doing the work at other times. There is no thinking time, which is creating massive disruption and reducing creativity and innovation. So there are a lot of elements that are driving huge amounts of frustration from people.
And as you know, we work with senior leaders and leaders throughout businesses, actually, right from emerging talent up. And the number one thing they tell us is that they do not have enough time and space to think or create. And businesses are suffering as a result. I'm really mindful of, we could obviously talk for hours. I'm mindful of time. And I want to ask you a bit of a horrible question, really. I'm really mindful of our audience. And they're sitting here, I'm sure, listening to you going, this makes perfect sense. We get it. What advice, but they're also having to go and talk to the powers that be and go, we need to use our office in a different way. Mm-hmm. I suspect you guys have some amazing research which you could share with them, but what would you say if you were to give them a couple of tips of where to start to how to create that change? What would it be?
Well, I think it's what's really where the data helps is that particularly as senior leaders, really begin to recognize that something's wrong when they see the data points. And I don't think you can make transformational change unless you have inspired leaders on board, right? They need to walk the talk and they need to really drive the organization. But I think what's also really challenging here is that it's not a single answer. I think everyone's looking for the answer of 3 days a week, structured hybrid. This is it. It's about recognizing the diversity of the workforce and the varying demands and conditions that enable people to thrive. Mm-hmm. And I think raising that awareness for leaders that they have the opportunity through hybrid work to really empower their people to thrive, I think is something that's really, really critical. So stop trying to find the single answer and engage people to co-create that answer with leadership.
Perfect. Thank you. And that word thrive is coming up so much for us in our work at the moment. It's a totally different mindset. So talking about mindset, we're going to shift. So thank you. I'm sure everyone wants to hear hours more of you talking. We're going to shift the focus now, because I think when I chose these two subjects, I'm like, there are two things that are going to make a massive difference. That is one of them. The second one is actually understanding the true nature of well-being, the fact that it is innate. So I'm not going to say too much. I'm going to turn to Steve, who is my guru on all stuff innate well-being. Steve, I'm going to ask again with a bit of a killer question. I was going to say shitty, but I'm not allowed to say that. What do we mean by innate well-being, Steve?
Okay, yeah. So innate well-being, as I would see it, and I know as we would see it at Ivy House, is this realization that at the very deepest level, we're actually already sitting right in the middle of our well-being. So another way of saying that is that it comes preloaded. It's part of our nature. It can't get damaged or tarnished, but we can get distracted or disconnected from it. And it's also this realization that it's when we are genuinely connected to this innate well-being that we do our very best work, both as individuals and as leaders of others and creators of cultures as well. So when we're coming from that place and leading and living from that place of connection to it, that's when we have real clarity of thinking. We can see different perspectives. We're letting go of ego, which all exists in thought. We're able to tap into that innate creativity and resilience that's in us as well.
Oh God, even when you start talking, I'm starting to feel better already. So, but okay, let me just repeat what I've heard is that well-being exists within us. It's in here already. And actually, when we sit in that place, we are at our most creative, productive, wise selves, right? Doesn't feel that way to most people though most of the time, does it? It feels like our well-being is as a result of lots of things outside of us. So I guess my next question, Stephen, I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to ask you to do something. So the question really is, so how as individuals, let's start with individuals first and we'll move on to organizations, because just guys, one of the philosophies of Ivy House is that if you want organizational change, you have to start with the individuals, right? You're only ever going to get organizational change if you create behavioral change. So starting with the individuals, Steve, how do we access our own innate well-being? And I'm going to ask you, I know we haven't got a lot of time, but I'm going to ask you to take us through a little bit of an exercise to demonstrate how we actually access our innate well-being. That would be cool if you've got time for that.
Okay, perfect. So I would say that there are 3 steps, and they're actually not complex, but they're pretty unknown or uncommon. So the first step is actually just to see it, to realize that our well-being is innate. Because I'm guessing that for most of us on the call, and looking at all of your amazing faces, and I'm guessing for most people that might be a paradigm shift. It might be a new perspective or a fresh perspective. So the first step is seeing that, and really seeing it, not just knowing it intellectually, but feeling it, and that being a way of being almost in the world. This realization that it can't get damaged, can't get tarnished, is always accessible, but that it's very easy to be looking away from it and looking in the wrong direction. And that, I think you were pointing to a bit earlier, Elke, when you were saying that it's easy then to start trying to change things outside of ourselves. You know, I need that person to be like this. I need my boss to be like that. I need the budget change. I need the conditions to be X, Y, Z, then I'll be okay. So that's step 1, is just realizing or seeing it through this new lens. The second step then is about understanding, well, if that's our nature, but as you're pointing to, Elke, it doesn't feel like it a lot of the time, what is it that's getting in the way? Why are we not experiencing it moment by moment? And when we look really closely, what you start to realize is that it's our thinking that is getting in the way. Thinking can block it, or it can seem like it blocks it. So just to play that out for everyone on this call, I invite you now just to bring to mind an event that was challenging, like a work event that you think, you know what, that happened, this particular situation, and it brings to mind, I guess, a day when it felt like a really challenging day. So a big challenge happened, you were working long hours, you felt stressed, there didn't feel like there was enough time. By the end of the day, you've gone well over your working hours and you leave your desk feeling pretty exhausted. Now, I'm guessing, first of all, that pretty much everyone on the call, if not everyone, can go, I can remember that, and it doesn't feel long ago. The second thing is that it's very easy then to go, well, it must be the situation that triggered that. It must be the extent of the challenge, or the lack of time or resources. And yet, now I'm going to invite you to bring to mind another memory from your past, another day where pretty much the same thing happened. It was another challenging event, not expected, not wanted in that moment. But actually, you ended up, and you still worked long hours, you still finished after your contracted hours, but actually this time you thrived. You actually felt pretty calm through the day. You felt resourced. You collaborated with other people. And yes, you might have been tired when you got into bed at the end of the day, but actually you felt like that was an amazing day. I'm seeing some nods on the screen. So what you're noticing is, well, how can that be? Because you've got 2 situations that are the same, but 2 very different inner experiences of those situations. So what you're starting to notice is that there's something else going on, and it's invisible, which is why we don't see it. And that's the thinking that we are bringing to the events moment by moment. So with the first event, you may well have been hanging out with thoughts, and often these thoughts are below the level of our conscious awareness, and they're like a lens we see the world through. So the first event, there might have been thoughts like, I haven't got enough time for this. I don't get paid enough for this. I haven't got a big enough team to do this. This isn't fair, and whatever else. In the second event, on the second day, you might have been hanging out again, maybe unconsciously, but with thoughts of, do you know what, we can do this. And yeah, this is complex, but do you know what a great opportunity to learn and grow and collaborate as a team. So that's the second realization, is understanding what is it, or the second step is understanding what is it that blocks it. And that's always our thinking. And then the third and final step is around starting to build the practice of letting go of that thinking that drives unnecessary fear, unnecessary anxiety, unnecessary pressure, that actually gets in the way of us doing our best work, showing up in our best way as conscious leaders. And that's what we at Ivy House obviously call conscious mind, stepping into that place of awareness behind our thinking mind. So those would be the 3 pieces. Oh, you're just on mute again, Elke.
Trying to be so efficient. Normally I don't put myself on mute and then I get told off, and now I put myself on mute and it's not working. Thank you. So again, thinking of our audience, Steve, you've been talking about personal well-being, about how we access that inner calm, that state of consciousness. From an organizational perspective, most of our audience will be from L&D, from CPOs to HRDs and all the rest of it. And they're thinking, okay, how does this relate to organizational well-being? So again, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Despina, I guess, is what advice would you give these guys? How do they start to introduce this deeper, and I believe in my experience, game-changing understanding of well-being into their businesses?
Great question. So I guess for me, that if we're coming to the bottom line, it's about creating training or bringing this understanding fully into our business, into your organizations. So it's building training that is genuinely founded on the true underlying principles, you could say, of well-being, rather than necessarily on something that an understanding, an old perspective that might be taking us to look in the wrong direction. So this is, for me, and I know for us as IOV House, is around, well, how do we create an organizational culture where this understanding is first of all seen and understood, but also embedded and cascaded across the business? So how do you build a culture where your leaders see this and really understand on a pretty profound level, personally for themselves, that their well-being is innate, that they can access it? Will they get lost in their thinking sometimes? Absolutely. Do I get lost in my thinking sometimes? Absolutely. It can be very compelling. But when you've seen behind the curtains and you realize, oh, I just got lost in the thoughts about and the feelings that came from those thoughts, you can't unsee what you've seen or unknow what you know. So yes, you may get lost in it again, but probably for a shorter amount of time, and then you can come out of it. So when your leaders start to model that to others, and then start to create cultures where that understanding is shared and understood, that is a game changer. And it's a game changer for me on two levels, which circles back, I think, to how you introduced this session, Elke. And the first is it's a game changer in starting to take us away from all of those unbelievable costs, the billions of pounds in terms of lost productivity. You're starting to see, if people are connected to their well-being and working from that place, you're going to naturally have fewer sick days and less long-term stress leave. So you're moving away from that. And just as importantly, you're moving in to an environment where people are thriving, where they're accessing their innate creativity, they're thinking with clarity of thought, there's less ego playing out in the business, and all of those positive benefits as well.
Do you know what you're making me think about is the job of leadership. And what I mean by that is we often talk at Ivy House about the what and how of leadership. And the what of leadership is the job of leadership is, it comes down to three things. It's about creating a vision, like what are we trying to build here? It's about creating a plan. How are we going to build that thing? And then it's about creating an environment in which people can deliver against the plan and deliver the vision. And that's at its purest level, that's the job of any leader: vision, plan, environment. And it seems to me like we sort of need to grow up around environment, both from a physical space, use of connection, energy, and then actually this environment of well-being. Like I'm certainly of an age where it's a badge of honor, where if you're exhausted because you've been working so hard. And there's something I think about being courageous enough as leaders now to call that out for what it really is, which is toxic resilience. That's effectively what it is. And, people talk a lot about resilience today, but actually resilience is a natural human condition if we're well. Like, we don't have to create resilience if we're well. So thank you. I am conscious that we have about 5 minutes for questions. Bryony, I can't see the chat, so I don't know if we have any, but do we have any? And if we don't, I have a couple of other questions for Despina and Steve.
We don't have any questions. I think everyone's busy absorbing everything they've heard today.
But if anyone wants to just put their hand up now, if they have a question, feel free, and Bryony can come to you. Should I give you a moment to do that, or no? I'll move on. So I guess the big thing here then is courage for me, is having the courage to speak to this. And this is again another hard question, but again, Despina, I'm going to come to you. Have you seen clients that have just gone, jeepers, we have to make a stride forward here? Have you seen that happen?
Well, I'm seeing more and more of it happen, because as I said, a lot of the kind of the mandates to get people back to work, they're just not working, right? So we're seeing just significant pushback from employees to the way they're being treated by their managers. So I think, many managers that actually, and senior leaders particularly, are starting to kind of think about how they can personally drive intentionality, right? Why will people want to come in? How do they personally enable them to feel better, to work better, to deliver better outcomes? So it's starting to happen. I definitely don't think it's happening at the scale that it could be happening, but I definitely believe that the data that we're seeing and some of the numbers that you were quoting earlier, in terms of the missing opportunity and the negative impact of well-being, is definitely going to push that way. And I suppose the question for me is, how do we help them create that awareness? Some of the things that we just heard from Steve is about, both individuals and leaders starting to have that awareness, that holding up a mirror to people and helping them recognize what they can do differently is going to be critical. And, although I focus on the space side, I always say to people that space is not the answer. Space, yes, engenders behaviors, absolutely, and it impacts well-being. But unless you have the leadership, the culture, the values that will drive those outcomes, unless you know the why, you're not going to be able to have the right results.
Do you know what keeps striking me here is there's a whole new set of skills for leaders. We just recently wrote a white paper on modern leadership. And actually, what we're asking leaders to do right now is have this deep understanding of their own personal well-being. Leaders have generally never had that. They're the ones that are killing themselves working over here. So we're asking them to have that own awareness of their well-being. We're asking them to learn a new skill and then engender that within the environment that they're creating. So I'm going to go back to something you just said, Despina, which is there is no one answer. And I would add to that it's a journey that we all have to sort of head in the right direction, and not expect to have like, okay, here's the plan. In 12 months' time, it's all going to be sorted. There's sort of a faith thing going on here, which I think we need to recognize. Steve, my question for you is, I know you work with leaders every day in the classroom, in the room. We shouldn't call it classroom, in the room. And I just want to know, what are you experiencing from these leaders on a day-to-day basis? What are the stories and the tales and the belief systems, the emotions that are coming out from them?
Oh, that's a great question. I think time is one that comes up time and time again, really regularly. So I don't have enough time. And that creates, that thinking creates a lot of pressure. Now, of course, nothing that we do in this space suddenly buys you an extra 3 hours in a day. We'd love to do that, but that's not available. And yet what I often notice is that when people get this understanding, not just the well-being piece, but well-being as we're pointing to here is very connected to this place of conscious mind. understanding the nature of thinking and the impact it has on our feelings and then our behaviors, when people start to realize and again see behind the curtains that how we're feeling always comes through the filter of our thinking about an event. What we often find, and I certainly often find, is they come back in after this understanding, maybe a couple of months later to the next masterclass, and we hear people say things like, do you know what? I had exactly the same kind of challenge that I had before this understanding. And before it, I was in my head and I felt really stressed. And I'll be honest, you wouldn't have wanted to be in my team as a manager and as a leader. And then this happened after this understanding, and I started to go that way, and I spotted it, and I took a breath, which I would never normally have done. And I actually stepped away for a minute and reconnected and allowed that thinking, that scarcity of time thinking, to go. And what they tend to find is that new, fresh thinking tends to emerge in its place. Now, it doesn't solve all the time challenges, but what is the quality of their doing after looking after the quality of their being? Consistently, we hear pretty amazing stories about what impact that has for them, but also that for their teams, the people they lead, and the cultures that they're creating as well.
Thank you. Despina, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just so struck by what Steve was saying about, sort of the awareness of looking behind the curtain of what our thoughts and, our ability to control that, what impact it has. And I also have the same thing happen when people become aware of how their environment begins to impact them, right? For many years, I spoke to companies about, how the quality of fresh air would impact people's cognitive performance, sense of well-being. Well, of course, within 3 months in COVID, we all became fresh air experts, and suddenly it made sense. But if you think about, the environment can be healing, or it can actually bring even more stress. So 77% of people are actually really sensitive to sound, and we don't design soundscapes for the office that allows people to connect with what their physical sense requires them. So if you were able to align what Steve is saying in terms of your mind and how we process our thoughts alongside, good quality of light, air, sound, natural materials, just think of what impact you can begin to make in an organization.
In fact, one of the stats that I forgot to share at the beginning, Despina, is that when we did our research, only 2% of people felt inspired or motivated by the space in which they work. 2%.
Well, inspiration is kind of a magical word, because we do a lot of regression analysis on our data. And when we look at what are the kind of drivers, the underlying drivers of productivity, sense of well-being, sense of engagement, inspiration is one that is consistent across all of the sort of 20 metrics that we use in our data.
And when you think about this, task focus, tick everything off your list, there's no inspiration in that, right? Exactly. Where do we get inspiration? When we're collaborating, when we're working, feeling belonging, feeling valued. So, right, now I am mindful of time, guys. It is 1:15. So for me, so thank you both massively. For me, the takeaways are, we absolutely have to shift our mindset in terms of how we develop our leaders. I saw somebody made the really relevant point about, the level of competency leaders have to have today around diversity, inclusion, around mental health, around all of these different areas, disadvantaged people in different minority groups. How do we do that? The job of leadership has become so huge. It would be really easy for them to go into thought spirals and think it wasn't doable. So this teaching about sitting in your calm, in your wisdom, in your power, couldn't be more important. So I'm going to leave it there, guys. We've loved having you. Once again, we'd love some feedback. I'm sure Brian is going to put something in the chat or send something to you. Any questions, please ask. Please give us feedback. And thank you so much for your time. be well, be calm, find your inner peace. It's been a joy to be here with you today. Thank you so much. Bye.